did 5 years ago, because there are so many growing markets outside the United States. It used to be, we used to say if we dropped our consumption 10, 15%, it would have a huge impact on the cartels, their money. That's no longer true. We can drop our consumption rate now 10, 15%, and the other markets that are compensating for it will make sure that the FARC and the Mexican organizations, other drug cartels, will still have the money to continue functioning in ways that simply didn't exist before. But I think one also has to look at, and this goes to what Matt was saying, sort of the other alliances that Chavez is building through the FARC. And what I find most interesting is this book, La Guerra Periférica y el Islam Revolucionario, which is Peripheral Warfare and Revolutionary Islam, Origins, Rules, and Ethics of Asymmetrical Warfare, written by a Spanish academic who's neither Muslim nor a military person. And it's actually, if you read it, it's kind of a meandering anti-globalization discourse. But the fundamental thesis is that radical Islam has showed us how to defeat the empire, meaning the United States. And the models he chooses in his book are Osama bin Laden and Carlos the Jackal. And the central thesis of the book is that radical Islam has showed us that collateral damage, the ability to kill massive amounts of civilians, is now acceptable. We've moved beyond the phase where it's not, and asymmetrical warfare of the future will involve the South, Iran, Venezuela, and others using weapons of mass destruction against the United States. An interesting book, not a very well-written book, and it would be of little note except that Hugo Chavez had the author come deliver the keynote address to his asymmetrical warfare conference in 2005 in Caracas, and adopted the book as part of Venezuela's official military doctrine. It had copies, pocket-sized copies printed up for his entire officer corps, and is now required reading and studying in the Venezuelan military, being transmitted to the Bolivian military particularly. Ecuador has not bought into this yet. What's disturbing about this is it shows how the different overlapping networks are working. You have Iran pushing in with Hezbollah, tied into the whole concept of asymmetrical warfare, which Chavez embraces publicly and warmly many times a month in his weekly speeches, tied into a drug trade that's generating billions of dollars. And I don't think that this means we're going to see massive amounts of suicide bombers coming across into the United States, but I think it shows a mindset that this alliance between radical Islam, drug trafficking groups, and other ideologically motivated groups, if the FARC can still be called an ideological movement in any sense, are now spreading across the continent in ways that are dangerous. And what's particularly dangerous is the cross-pollination among these groups as they learn from each other, study each other, and build networks across each other's networks. So you see the FARC operating in Spain through the ETA networks. You see Hezbollah operating through the FARC networks in Latin America, and this whole cross-pollination that didn't exist 10 or 15 years ago, certainly not to the level it does now. And that brings me to the Movimiento Bolivariano, which, when it was founded, had a different name, but in December it became officially the movement. Before it was the coordinating group, and it maintains about 60 offices across Latin America. And if you read the FARC documents captured from Raul Reyes' computer, who was killed on March 1st, 2008, when the Colombians attacked into Ecuador and killed Raul Reyes, they outline very clearly in the FARC documents the founding of the Movimiento Bolivariano. They'll tell you that they're not related to the FARC, but the documentary evidence is they were founded in 2004 in Caracas with the presence of Chavez, and there's a lot of internal communication where the FARC complains that they don't get proper credit for forming the Coordinadora, later the Movimiento, that they put all this effort into it and nobody knows it's them, and they're not very happy about it. What this does is give them a broad network of people that they can recruit and work through that goes from Argentina to Mexico, and particularly in Mexico with the Universidad Nacional and the FARC movement. Their ability to support armed movements, you see the sort of the umbrella group going there. And the other area of overlap, when I've talked to some of the people who have gone back and forth on this program, is Iran is steadily recruiting cadres of young people, groups of 20 or 30 at a time, to go to Iran for special training. And I've talked to people in Bolivia. That's happening in Nicaragua. It's happening extensively in Venezuela, and it's happening in El Salvador, where you get people recruiting either late high school students or early university students. A lot of them they go through Nicaragua to Caracas, where they have large camps of several hundred, and from there the people from the different countries are selected out for special training in Iran, and they'll go over for 30 to 90 days. They learn intelligence, counterintelligence, crowd control, which Iran is getting to be quite good at these days, and other sort of skills. And then they come back into the country and they sort of disappear into the bureaucracies or into the or into the universities where they are. They also recruit, and particularly in Nicaragua, government people to float over and take this training. So you have this sort of network, this floating sort of groups of people who do different things at different times, with all, and the only unifying sort of theme of all of these groups, from Hamas to Chavez, or Hezbollah and Hamas to Chavez, to the FARC, the only thing that really unites them is the hatred for the United States. You can see there's certainly other things that unite Chavez and the FARC. There's nothing that unites Venezuela and Iran except that particular thing, and the belief that asymmetrical warfare is coming and that they can defeat the United States through that particular methodology. So I think we're in a particularly dangerous time where these relationships are not cemented. They're constantly floating, as I said, but they do have access to billions of dollars of revenue that flow through them and empower the non-state actors as they move across the continent. And if you read what Chavez says, which we seldom do, and we seldom believe him when he says what he's going to do, but then he does it and we're surprised, he's clearly has embraced the concept of armed revolution across the continent for non-Bolivarian states. And if you look at what's happening in Paraguay with the Ejército Popular suddenly flaring up again, the Mapuches in Chile, the MIR in Chile, the rebirth of Tupac Amaru in Peru, you see that the money that flows through these are going to groups that I thought, having lived in the region and covered the region for many years, were defunct. I thought that sort of whole network had sort of disappeared, but clearly it hasn't. And you don't see them in large force out there yet. I would predict, particularly as Chavez acquires his weapons from Russia as they come in, and most particularly when his Kalashnikov factory comes online later this year and he's able to manufacture 30 to 40,000 Kalashnikovs a year in Venezuela, of which there'll be no export controls. You'll see these groups growing very rapidly as they move forward, and much more better equipped than they are right now. And this is where the cross-pollination, I think, the problem comes in, because you have Hezbollah teaching the FARC, who's teaching ETA, who's teaching Hezbollah, and you have a whole series of learned experiences that are added to each other. And if you look at the FARC's experience with ETA and with the IRA, they clearly learned specifically how to make certain types of bombs from ETA that they then used against the Colombian military to great effect. They specifically learned counterintelligence techniques from the IRA that they were able to use to great effect. And so you have this training pool that moves across there. And I'd just like to close looking at the Angostura bombing in March 1st, 2008, when the Colombian military decided to launch a raid into Ecuador and kill Raul Reyes, the #2 commander of the FARC, because it shows, I think, a lot of these things working together. What was happening the last week of February in 2008, just before they killed Raul Reyes, was a meeting of the Coordinadora Continental Bolivariana in Quito. This is the precursor to the Movimiento Bolivariano. And the Colombians were watching, we were watching, the Brits were watching, other people were watching, and this was an officially sponsored event by the government of Ecuador. And into that meeting, which was a public meeting, you had ETA, you had Hamas, you had Irish Republican Army, you had all these terrorist organizations sending their representatives there to be addressed by video by Raul Reyes of the FARC, who is one of the presidents of the Coordinadora Continental. What the Colombians were watching is that these groups, these delegations, including the delegation of students from the Mexican universities, were flying down to Lago Agrio and then taking buses down to the border region and meeting with Raul Reyes. And the Colombians were afraid, having lived the prior experience of the ETA cross-training and the IRA cross-training, that this was becoming a witch's brew of folks sitting there training each other, creating a network that would be lethal to Colombia. And that was one of the trigger factors in the decision to launch an armed raid across into Ecuador, because they simply felt it was intolerable to have a terrorist network being built there on the ground in Ecuador while the Ecuadorians knew where the camp was and refused to take action about it against it. It had been there for many months. But the trigger factor was the number of international terrorist organizations that were coming and learning from each other and setting up camp there. So if you understand that, you understand perhaps the Angostura bombing in a little different light. And I guess I'll leave it there as my time's up. And that way I go a little bit further north.
Thank you, Dr. Delroy.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Delroy and Wolfcraft, for the opportunity. I think we, all of us, share a concern that we're faced with a number of irregular conflicts in various parts of the world. We're focusing on the Americas today, but we share a general concern But I would like to focus on Mexico specifically. And rather than talk only or primarily about the bad guys in Mexico, I really want to talk about the battle for the soul of Mexico, what's happening sort of a little bit on the side of the good guys, and what our stake in that struggle is, and what we might be able to do to influence that outcome. As I said, as a capsule sort of topic here, I would say that there is a battle for the soul of Mexico that's going on. It's been going on for some time, it's intensified, and it will continue to go on, I think, for some time. I'd sort of like to map out some of the players here, or the various sides that are participating in this struggle. And I would suggest to you that the main problem in Mexico is from armed groups, but particularly what we would call criminal-oriented armed groups. It's not always easy to distinguish their motives from terrorists or insurgents or warlords and militias. But I would say that the main problem that the Mexicans have with maintaining their democracy are criminal organizations. Now, these organizations are not particularly interested in providing a lot of information about them. The government of Mexico provides some, but not a great deal. And the government of the United States provides a little. It is very difficult, really, to document with precision the capabilities, the resources, the skills of these organizations. But occasionally we get bits and pieces, and we put these pieces together to make some kind of a mosaic out of it. I would say that you have to remember that in Mexico you have some very sophisticated, now well-financed resourced and skilled transnational criminal organizations. And the primary ones that we talk about are drug trafficking organizations, but these organizations are quite capable of engaging in a variety of other criminal activities, such as extortion, kidnapping as a business, human smuggling as a business, when they decide to branch out into these organizations. But I think you have somewhere between about 4 and 6 sophisticated transnational criminal organizations operating both north of the border and south, and sometimes, as Doug was suggesting, into other parts of the world, such as West Africa and Europe. Probably if you were trying to estimate the numbers of people that are employed in these organizations or working more or less full-time for these organizations, it's somewhere around 5,000 to 10,000 people inside Mexico. Now there is no statistic that one can sort of officially use here, but this is based on, as I said, putting pieces together from different organizations, different interviews with, diverse interviews with people who participated in these organizations, people who are in jail and out of jail. And so we sort of try to put this in some kind of a context. They're heavily concentrated in the center and north, but they also are in the southern part and in between. But there's a large concentration on trying to acquire influence and power in the northern part of Mexico's territory. But beyond these major trafficking organizations, which get most of the attention of the media and of governments when they talk about this, we have to really say that there are other lesser gangs who are also organized, not organized with the same degree of skill and competence and the resources of the transnational gangs, but there's a spectrum from quite sophisticated local and regional gangs to street gangs, which are not very sophisticated and only really operate in neighborhoods. But we're talking about somewhere in the order of 100,000 people who are members of street gangs and other kinds of gangs in Mexico. And they too engage in various kinds of local drug trafficking, kidnapping, extortion, and other criminal acts. But the relationship between these gangs is very important, that the sophisticated criminal organizations exploit or use the local criminal gangs to do a lot of their work, whether it's contract killing, whether it's the protection of their transportation routes, whether it's the production of some of the drugs. There's an enormous interrelationship between the big-time transnational criminal organizations and these local, if you will, gangsters. Some of these local gangsters also can be can also engage in transnational activities, and we would have to put into this category organizations like the Mara 13 organization, the Mara 18, sometimes called October 18 organizations, which actually operates across the borders, south and north and into cities, and actually Washington, D.C. suburbs is one of the areas in which they operate quite a lot in this area, and so on. The aims of these organizations is not sort of political the way we normally think about politics. It is not to take power in Mexico or elsewhere. They do not want to run the government of the country. But in another sense, they are political. What they want to do is they want to be able to neutralize the power of the government. They want the power to neutralize the Mexican government, and so that they can do their business. And to do that, they will use a variety of means that make them very similar to the kinds of activities that we see in insurgent or more political types of organizations. Their rivals are not just the Mexican state, however. Their rivals are their fellow criminals. And so the trafficking organizations spend a great deal of their time, energy, resources, and killing power, killing and dominating other criminal organizations or subjugating them to their particular interests. But there are some people who would say that these are criminal insurgencies. I think that's going a little bit too far. I think insurgencies is more political, more ideological. I'm not saying that there isn't a culture and a vision that some of these criminals have, but the vision basically is power for themselves and their organization, rather than actually taking control of the society or somehow changing a society the way an Al-Qaeda or a FARC or some of the other organizations that we can talk about do try to do. The options for these criminal organizations, both the transnational and the gangs, their options are to negotiate deals with each other and with the state. They are very interested in trying to minimize the amount of resources that they have to spend on achieving their ends. If they can, they're in that sense economic actors. And so if they can negotiate arrangements with others, they will do so. And they seek opportunities for negotiations. Now, to sort of facilitate their negotiations, one of the main techniques they use is bribery and corruption. And so we have groups operating, and I will come back and return to the culture of Mexico, but we're groups operating in a culture where bribery and corruption is, let's say, not unknown. And they are quite skilled here at exploiting some of the trends that have been one could see in Mexican society for some time. And they do use a lot of bribery and corruption. But at times, their negotiating strategy and their attempt to suborn the local law enforcement or the national local law enforcement authorities is insufficient. So they will, in fact, then, of course, resort to violence. And they have quite a sophisticated mechanisms to do this, and that is what gets the attention in our media. And so one has the sort of sense that Mexico is falling apart, that there are lots of killings, there are sort of copycats of Al-Qaeda in Iraq or Taliban in the way they behave with their use of violence. But as I said, they are quite capable of negotiating and organizing arrangements so that they can pursue their activities without having to use violence. And I make this point because that is one of their options. And then we're going to have to sort of now turn to the other side of the equation and see who is battling them and what their options are. I would say that the other side of the equation are democratic and rule of law oriented leaders in Mexico and their institutions. And we spend, I think, here in the United States far too little attention on those people. If you just look at the elected leaders who are willing to stand up and against the criminal elements. We have leaders in all the major parties now in Mexico who are willing to stand up and declare that they will not deal with these organizations. Now, come to the fact that there are going to be some others in Mexico who have a different view, but the point is you have an elected president who is categorically opposed to negotiation or dealing with the criminal elements. It's practically a war between the state, the government, and the people on one side from the point of view of the president, and the criminal elements on the other. He's made this very clear. He has to take all the precautions that a person would have to take who is willing to take on these sophisticated organizations. These transnational criminal organizations have shown themselves capable of penetrating almost any organization in Mexico. They've shown themselves capable of bribing almost any level in Mexico. And yet these leaders in Mexico are willing to stand up, and they do every day to confront and to try to wage what they consider to be a violent conflict, war, if you will, against the criminals. I think these leaders can be found at the federal level, but I think we can also find these leaders in many states and in some municipalities. And unfortunately, a number of these leaders have been murdered by the criminals, and some have been reached by the bribery capability that the criminals use as well. But on the whole, we have now three parties. All of them have leaders, some of their leaders, and the president of the country now standing up. In addition, I think we have to remember that you have roughly 1 million soldiers and policemen in Mexico. We have about 500,000 soldiers and about 500,000 policemen and 250,000 soldiers in Mexico who are working on these matters. Now, not all the police are believers in this war. Not all of the military are believers. Not all of the civil servants in Mexico are believers in the strategy of the president. But we do have many, I would say hundreds of thousands of them who do believe this. And again, almost every day now you have a policeman or a soldier that is killed in the line of battle on this subject. We have also in civil society in Mexico now thousands of teachers and businessmen and priests and media personnel who are willing to stand up, and many also have suffered for their willingness to oppose the criminal elements. Given their situation, what are their options? They can continue to stand up. They can continue to struggle as they have been for the last few years, basically an all-out struggle with the criminal elements. But there are those amongst them who say in the short term the government cannot be strong enough to prevail against the criminal elements. And as the government can't prevail, wouldn't it be better if we tried to reduce the violence and try to negotiate some arrangements with the criminals, either at the local level, state level, or even a national level? And so there is a temptation to abandon the all-out struggle that the Calderon administration has waged with the support of a number of the other parties. And there will be a temptation as this war goes on, as there is in other democracies, when war is prolonged, when conflict seems endless, and sometimes it's a very brutal conflict, even if it's not widespread, it's still brutal. And other democracies have decided to set a timetable. Other democracies haven't always stayed the course. And this will be a struggle inside Mexico, and this is what I'm referring to in a way as the battle for the soul of Mexico. The government those who are waging the battle all out know that they have a problem. They have to show some results, but it is very difficult to show results in the short term. The number of killings now is much higher than it was a couple of years ago. That doesn't show any real sign of abating. The criminality, sort of, as far as we can measure it, it continues. The population is losing is losing patients and its sufferance for this. I don't think there is the danger that we tended to see some years ago that Mexico would sort of fall to an authoritarian leader, populist leader. I think the danger in this case is that people will decide that they have to go seek another strategy than the strategy that Calderon and the other leaders have been following for the last couple of years. Mexico still is a relatively poor place. 30 to 40% of its population lives well below the thresholds that we would find acceptable in the United States. There is a growing middle class, but it's getting impatient too with the insecurity in the society, mostly what they see from the criminal struggles with the government. I think we have an enormous stake. We in the United States have an enormous stake in the battle for the soul of Mexico. If the battle gets better and goes well, we'll benefit economically, we'll benefit in many ways, and we will reduce the risk that Matt Levitt and Doug Farah talk about of insurgents exploiting the criminal elements to get access to the United States. I think we have to say so far there have been relatively few signs of exploitation. That doesn't mean that they won't come in the future. It just means that so far we the Mexicans and we the United States have not seen very many signs of problems. But one, of course, has to keep watching because we have other groups in the world that are interested in the southern security perimeter of the United States. So it will be an ongoing process. But so far, the main problem is the criminal one. And we do have an enormous stake in this battle. If the balance of power shifts and people start negotiating with the criminals, one of the things they may be willing to negotiate about is what access they'll allow to entry into the United States. I think at the moment the criminals would prefer not to get involved in access in the United States. They would prefer not to engage in spillover into the United States, prefer to stay in their own territory where they have relative impunity, and it's much easier for them, cheaper for them to do business on the Mexican side of the border. And so that's one of the reasons I would argue you have this relative peace on our side of the border and you have relative war on the other side. But should the balance of power change in Mexico, that would be open for negotiation, what happens across the U.S. side of the border. With regard to what we can do about it, I think we're in a position that in the short term it's going to be very difficult to achieve results. I think it will be very hard to see results. What we can see, though, is that the United States and the Mexicans are cooperating in a way that I don't think we've ever seen before. That is to say, the Mexican government and the U.S. government are collaborating top and down below in various ways, mostly to build up Mexican capabilities. Sometimes it's also to ensure that we are doing our part on our side of the border to help, that is to enforce our own laws, particularly with regard to arms trafficking. But the essence of this is really building up the capacity of the Mexican government to be able to stand up, to maintain itself and stand up to the criminal onslaught which can be expected to continue for some time to come. I think the previous administration in the United States, the Bush administration, negotiated a very good arrangement with the Mexicans, which is now called the Merida Accords, and we're now negotiating. We have negotiated and continue to negotiate post-Merida agreements, and along the same track, which involves us helping the Mexicans build up their capacity to be able to listen. The Mexicans are not asking us for forces, and we don't need to send our forces there, but they want skill sets. We know what the skill sets are. We can train them. We are training, providing equipment, but also now we can provide more and more training, and the Mexicans are very receptive to that, both on the governmental level and I would say in civil society. I think there's been a psychological turn in Mexico that's never been seen before, and that psychological turn is that Mexicans, not all of them, but many of them now, see that the problem of criminality in their society is not just American drug consumption and American arms trafficking across the border. They see it as their problem. They see it as it's themselves. They are the problem, just as people, I think, in Colombia began to see that a few years ago. And so we're starting to see a movement here now that we didn't see before in civil society, NGOs, the media, and others, beginning now to say that this is our problem. We have to deal with it. We can get help from others, the United States and others, but we have to deal with this. And this is new. This wasn't there 5 years ago. As I said, I think the Bush administration and the Obama people have been able to benefit from this. And you have, actually, I would argue, quite a sophisticated team now in the American Embassy and here in Washington, and the Mexican, they're working well with the Mexicans. But it's, these are all big organizations, and maybe John can tell us, how big organizations turn the ships around in a short period of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Roy, and this is a wonderful segue to John Walters. John, you have the final word on the panel, at least in the
Thank you.
presentation.
Well, thank you, and I'd like to thank my colleague, Ambassador Bloom, and Professor Falsgraf for helping to put together this issue and to keep it before people's minds. A lot of this, I think, I have to step back from that introduction, is to say this area and our understanding of it is, of course, evolving. Some of us in this room are old enough to remember back not so many years ago when terror and drugs or criminal activity was not for the varsity. The varsity did Cold War, did Soviet threat, did global strategic policy, and they didn't get their hands dirty with this at the security or the diplomatic level. It's where people went to end their careers. Now the varsity does terror, and it does terror big time. In fact, it does terror more than it does a lot of other things. And I think what we're seeing is an evolution where the varsity's got to do more on these kinds of threats that in the gray area between global terrorist, ideologically based threats to the United States directly and its allies, and fundamental destabilizing forces. We are not doing a very good job of categorizing these and explaining that to the public as well as even to the experts here. We still mix these together as transnational criminal threats, which goes from everything from smuggling exotic birds to the Mexican mafias who are killing people and each other in the thousands. We need to be clear about those definitions so we can help to both evolve policies and to understand what policies work here. And I think that's another critical factor, which I'll try to touch on in a minute. I do think that this gets mixed even in the criminal and terroristic criminal group from local street gangs, and this of course expands not only to South America and Mexico, but Central America, where huge ethnic connections between criminal activities, some tied to drugs, some not, from Salvador, from Guatemala, from Honduras, and other countries. They are tied to communities in the United States where they use that base or that ability to hide to carry out activities, and it's also to carry on criminal work of their own. Those are another part of this threat, is the blending of the now more widely recognized and important terror threat and the kind of criminal mixtures that previous panelists have talked about. Part of what we're talking about is how do we anticipate mixtures that then become outlets for what we now think of as more serious global terror threats. We didn't think of them as much serious threats until, I guess, most of the country until September 11th, 2001. A lot of people worked on them for a long time and did many, many things, but the priority changed at that point in time. These groups are, of course, nascent helpers in not only the dangers they currently cause, but in much wider dangers, and as they work together, they establish the confidence and relationships that would allow them to be more important. The question is, how bad do they get before we take them seriously enough to neutralize that threat? Secondly, I would say we ought to be clear about what some of them are doing. Yes, there are local street gangs, as we all know and fields we refer to. But some of these other groups are essentially controlling and governing areas of territory or subpopulations or sectors. And given the fact that they're basically thugs and psychopaths, I would call them the creators of scumocracies that try to even control sectors along our southern border, have controlled parts of these countries before. It's not new, I would say, given the character of rule. You could say that both Cuba and Venezuela are also scumocracies at the present time, although they didn't come into being the way the Medellin and Cali cartel or some of the Mexican groups did. The willingness to use violence for personal profit, gain, advancement, and the desire to control and not just neutralize government, but in some cases, use the power of control to tax and to exploit local activities. That may not be ideological. It may just be the same old organized crime on a bigger scale. Yes, drugs has fueled them for a long time, still does in some areas, but in addition to the other crimes mentioned, they're of course involved in car thefts, protection rackets, counterfeiting, moving people, providing arms, and other things. I was disappointed that, despite all the good things I think President Calderon has brought here, that in his visit, essentially the discussion came down to, can we stop guns, and can we do more about helping Mexico? There's not enough specificity with that. First of all, my personal view is guns aren't the problem. Yes, there is in some ways a market for guns in the United States that some may object to, but the obvious difference between the guns on this side of the border and the situation that's created and guns on the Mexican side of the border that's created shows you that it's not the guns, it's kind of the people and the institutions that are dealing with them. Secondly, it's only been recently that Mexico's even tried to control the border, and you could many times stand there and watch no brake lights be hit as people drove south. So their own effort to try to control this. And there are a lot of guns in Mexico already. There are a lot of guns in the hemisphere already. That's really not the long pole, although I understand it's a very sensitive political issue, and certainly we should follow up on this. The real issue is we have to learn the lessons that we've learned in Colombia, that we've learned in terrorism, that the Mexicans also know about. We have to be more systematic in analyzing the composition of these individual groups, and we have to find the key leadership, and we have to, in the words of what we talk about in terrorism, we have to find, fix, and finish those targets. We have to bring them to justice. We have to have proportional responses to these threats, and we have to then begin able to control the areas, territory, and populations that have been suborned by these groups in a more systematic manner. That does require us to prioritize these threats. We can't do that everywhere. We can't help everybody. There are going to be both opportunities and real costs on the United States that have to be borne. We're not stacking these threats in a way that allow us to and have policymakers and Congress and journalists understand what we're picking. Obviously, where they overlap with global terror threats, as they do in parts of South America, in Central America, and other places, and there's a blending where the risk expands with the bad behavior of Venezuela under Chavez, and maybe, God forbid, Brazil, if that's going to continue. We are going to have a more sophisticated constellation of policies. But we're going to have a public discussion about that, because that's a different kind of issue. I would say there also has been a continued political blindness on a couple of dimensions to what we're doing here. We still have a kind of old left-right debate about Latin America, where having strong institutions of security is conceived of as antithetical to human rights and to democracy. Colombia has shown, and as President Uribe has said repeatedly, a strong government properly led is good for democracy. It saves lives, it reduces violence, it brings rule of law, it brings prosperity, and it brings opportunity. Yet Colombia in particular, as you see, is a victim of divisive politics inside the United States. More than any kind of other trade or any kind of other aid, trade is the biggest single opening the United States can offer the countries of Latin America, because the magnitude of economic benefit is much greater than any aid package or a combination of other government benefits. Yet we are now, to say the least, ambivalent, if not hostile, to some of the expanding trade. We don't talk about the benefits, and the countries that are beneficiaries don't sufficiently talk about them. That was an opportunity that I think President Calderon could have taken, although it would not necessarily have sat well with his host. In addition, I think we have to recognize that leadership in these countries has been a key to moving forward. The change in Colombia is, yes, a lot of work for a lot of people for a long time, but ultimately the necessary and sufficient condition was President Uribe. The necessary and sufficient condition of the movement you see in Mexico that offers promise, although we aren't there yet, is President Calderon. And you see the contrary in the leadership of Venezuela, for example, and the backsliding in Nicaragua, and the threats in some of the other places, Ecuador, Bolivia, and elsewhere. We need to support and find the areas where we're going to provide special support. It does need attention by the leadership of the government of the United States, and not just programs or people. But it also needs people and capacities. And it also is going to require us to decide to put intelligence resources, which are scarce and which are difficult to allocate in this environment, into these areas to know and understand what's going on and how to influence it in ways that are subtle, that are atypical and specific, and that are difficult at best to navigate. We have not spent enough time thinking about that, and we have not spent enough time to provide the understanding of both what the problem is and what the magnitude of the response has to be to shift the problem significantly in key areas where that's possible. So part of this is an understanding problem. I think we're evolving, we're getting there, but it's a little slow given the magnitude of what's happening. And lastly, I would say we're blinded by not seeing our own successes. Particularly, I'll take the example of the drug issue. I was asked yesterday by a New York Times reporter who's in Caracas, who's going to write about the drug problem and how all these years in Colombia of eradication and efforts have not worked. Well, the data is quite manifest and has been that way for a couple of years. President Uribe has made a dramatic change in both the availability of cocaine in the United States as measured by workplace testing and other sampling we have. And he's also made a difference by attacking that underlying production and the groups that do it and the extradition of people in the security of Colombia. It's as if that didn't happen, because the prevailing conventional wisdom is we don't make any difference against drugs, just the way we don't make any difference against corruption in Central and South America, or we don't make any difference in regard to poverty or equality in these areas. That's not true. And until we begin to be able to sort the empirical facts, both convenient and inconvenient, into an understanding that's real and honest and is something that we can build public support for policies that, again, will be somewhat difficult, one step or two steps forward, one step back in some cases. And until we can do that in a clearer way, we are going to be doing this with one hand tied behind our back. Now, we'll still have to do that, but the fact of the matter here is that, as with the war on terror, remarkable progress has been made September 11, 2001. And it's because people have aggressively gone after the problem as it's changed and morphed and worked very hard and are constantly sensitive to the limits. We need to do that with regard to these threats in this hemisphere if we're going to make a difference in reducing the terror threat that is both greater and potentially even bigger still, and the instability and criminal threats. We used to think if we had a form of democracy and private property, these countries would come along and develop and be democracies and be safe. Let's face it, that doesn't work. There are specific things that happen that make democracies work and not work, and we've got to begin to have a subtler view of institutions that we now look at in a very inadequate and imperfect way.
Thank you very much, John. Well, you've now heard from the panel, and now the panel would like to hear from you. So I think what we'll do is begin the questions and discussion. Please, I suppose I should begin by calling on you, and maybe others as well will want to do that as we proceed. But let's start right here. Please identify yourself and address the question to the panel member or members.
My name is Richard Dawson, and from Dawson Associates International Inc. First of all, congratulate all the members of the panel because of your very extensive knowledge of what's happening here in relation to narco trafficking and terrorism. I would like to make all of them, especially Douglas Farah, a question about what they think about the impact of the FARC in the Andean region, in their ties with Hezbollah, and also with Al-Qaeda and all of Africa. And also the second question would be if they think that Venezuela should be put in the list of states sponsoring terrorism in the Western Hemisphere.
Okay, thank you. Everyone heard the questions, right? So let's proceed. Shall we start with Chuck, and then maybe others on the panel? Matt, you may want to say something about this, knowing as much as you do about Hezbollah. Let's
Well,
start with Chuck.
On the question of the impact of the FARC with Al-Qaeda and Hezbollah, I think that if you look at the relationship between President Chavez and President Ahmadinejad, it's a very personal relationship, and they both sponsor non-state actors in areas outside of their national territory. And I think that given the history of both groups, that it's been documented that Hezbollah and Al-Qaeda were dealing together in Sudan in 1996 and thereabouts, and the FARC's ability to reach out and their willingness to cross ideological and religious borders, I think that tie, I don't think it's documented. The Colombians have talked about training camps in Venezuela and other things. I haven't seen documentary evidence that it's happened, but I think it's sort of inevitable that will coalesce in some form, whether it's just training and knowledge exchange or more. I don't know. Al-Qaeda, I think, has a much more difficult time in the region. I think that there are not very many Sunni Muslims in the region. There's not a Sunni Muslim community. When talking about the Shia community, you now have second or third generation folks across the continent who could move, who held valid national passports from their country of origin. I think they can move into our country pretty much at will on national airlines. I think the use of coyotes to come across the border is not particularly, in my mind, a high priority threat, because there's so many other easier and nicer ways to come in if they wanted to, and Chavez's willingness to pass out identity cards, and especially Daniel Ortega, Nicaragua's willingness as well. You have many options besides that coming in. I don't see Al-Qaeda being able to operate in a region without the expats, without the ethnic communities that they can fit into, and where they speak the language they could blend in. What was the other question? Oh, the dead state sponsor. I personally think that the price, I don't think that there's lack of evidence to designate Venezuela. I think that the cost to the United States and Latin America would be tremendously high. In my mind, at this point, it would be too high. I think there are intermediate steps you could take. You could designate PDVSA as the state sponsor of terror. They have to refine half of their oil in the United States because it's heavy and it can't be refined anyplace else. If you cut off their oil to the United States, we would pay a price in reduced oil imports, but you would also collapse immediately the main financial beam of the Chavez government. So I think there are intermediate steps you could take that would not alienate the entire continent if you were wanting to think a little more creatively about that.
Would anyone else on the panel like to comment?
I just add that on the last point, I agree. There are lots of countries actually that would hit threshold if you wanted to designate them as state sponsors. There's no statutory obligation to designate as a state sponsor every single country that hits threshold. Pakistan's not listed. Hezbollah is part of the government in Lebanon. It's not listed. Yemen for many years. At one point with November 17 and its ties to the Greek government. There were lots of governments. I was about to say you could put up for nomination. You really have to think of what are you trying to achieve, and I don't think that would necessarily be the best way to achieve our various goals in the region. In terms of the connections between FARC and some of the radical Islamist groups, I haven't seen them at a group-to-group level yet. I mean, I think that doesn't mean anything, because the nature of the terrorist threat today is that it's all about relationships, individual relationships, ad hoc relationships. I recall what a good friend, Mike Braun, who used to be the head of special operations at DEA, once said, which was that when he looks at the Western Hemisphere and elsewhere as well, you can see a lot of the same transnational threat actors from a variety of different types of threats, terrorist organizations, narco traffickers, etc., human smugglers, and others, using the same type of facilitation networks. Many of whom will, for them it's just crime, they'll take your money, they'll smuggle someone, etc. And so there I think you will see a crossover from time to time. I would also warn that there sometimes is, for some people, a need to make a threat important by lopping in with Al-Qaeda, as if threats aren't, threatening enough, even if they're not. the Azerbaijani government, when they prosecuted this Hezbollah network targeting the Israeli ambassador and this Azeri satellite station, I think undermined their case, though they ultimately got convictions when they said that there was an Al-Qaeda role in there too, for which, as far as I know, there was no evidence. And so we don't need to kind of boogeyman these threats. These threats are real, even if they aren't tied specifically to Al-Qaeda.
Next question is from right back here, please.
Philip Hughes from the White House Writers Group. Questions seem to come in pairs. I have two for the panel. Quickly. Keying off John Waters' remarks, traditionally when we look at these problems and saw Cold War type security threats, drugs challenges, terrorism challenges, and sort of stovepipes, there's always been inside our country some constituency or other that has looked at these problems from a sort of heterodox point of view. We saw Cold War in terms of being more sympathetic to the Russians that they faced from us, or we saw terrorism more through using Palestinian injustices and impeded Israeli capability, or that there were self-indulgent reasons for wanting to declare the drug war a waste and disaster and pursue an alternative kind of abandonment approach. And that's always, it seems to me, cross-checked our own policies, or limited how far or how consensually we could move against these threats. But now that we face a world, a sort of post-ideological world that Yuval described, whereas Dunfera says the hostile governments are mainly united by their hostility to the United States, and where they're collaborating with an increasingly toxic mix of criminality and drugs trafficking and murder and terror, do you think that bodes better for achieving consensus here about how to act and how to interact forcefully, or not? Second question, in all these societies, except those that are dominated actually by the hostile governments that are operating in the the pattern is the same, isn't it? It's a few thousand or tens of thousands at most of criminals or insurgents or terrorists, maybe hundreds of terrorists, in societies of tens of millions of people who are law-abiding. It's just sort of a small infection in a very large body politic. Does that suggest anything about how it's rooted out?
Who would like to tackle those questions?
I would say there's still ambivalence here in regard to a couple of things. One, can you do anything? I mean, which is a kind of threshold question for whether you take it seriously or not. That the corruption, the distance, the ability to influence within reasonable bounds of what you could expect to accomplish is still somewhat cynical. I mean, you see this with Mexico, where aside from everything else, the terror threats of having ungoverned spaces on our own southern border, but I believe it's a strategic threat to the United States if the government becomes unstable in Mexico, and people continue to have to flee in order for their own safety or own future to be attractive. You can turn that around, and I think President Calderon knows that. And I'm not one of those people who believe that Mexico's about to become a failed state. But the fact of the matter is, I mean, Roy mentioned earlier that democracies could make compromises. Almost all these countries did make compromises. It's now that they're not compromising that you see the violence. I mean, it's kind of the reverse of what it seems. It was peaceful, or more or less peaceful, or less violent than it is now, and now it's violent because somebody's doing something. No, actually, it's not that they're necessarily stronger, although in some cases they're stronger, but it's that somebody challenged them. And so I think we have to overcome the false view that we can't act. Now, again, it doesn't mean that it's easy. It doesn't mean it's fast. I also think there are people who push back against this in the United States quite strongly, in this hemisphere especially. If you say you want to strengthen the police, the intelligence services, or the security services of these countries, there are huge constituencies in government, in the private sector, in journalism, that will push back against you. And now, again, everybody understands you'd have to do that in a way that reinforces rule of law and justice and doesn't trample on it or destroy it. And in most of the places where we have worked with these countries and their institutions, we have a record of making them more professional, more effective, more law-abiding, more respecting of human rights. That doesn't seem to matter in the discussion at some levels. The willingness to carry that out. And I also think it's also important to have legal reform and prison reform. You can arrest a lot of people, but if you can't properly punish them, extradition is one thing, but it's hard and it's limited. It's kind of like running a vacuum cleaner and having no bag on the back to catch the dirt. You just blow them back out into society. You know, it defeats the confidence of institutions that you want. But you can do things that make a difference here. But you have to begin to kind of think of them as you know, a kind of plan and build the political confidence there and here, which I think today does not exist in sufficient force, certainly as we would like.
Anyone else on the panel? On this issue? Go ahead, please.
Well, I guess you were asking the question, Philippines, about the whole of the hemisphere, maybe the world. But let me just sort of take Mexico as an important example of case. I think we have a consensus on the Mexican issue. We have the resources allocated by the Congress. This is not a partisan matter. There's a continuity between Obama people who were there and the previous people and the likely sort of people who are sitting and waiting to take these jobs. There is a consensus here that this is a problem now. It wasn't always a first-tier priority. I think John also had to deal with this when it wasn't a first-tier, but I think this is a first-tier priority. There are factors that will militate against the maintenance of this consensus. And that is that it will take time. And I agree with John that it's not well understood and it's difficult. We're used to thinking about conflicts as something that with a beginning, a middle, and an end, and we want the end to come fast. And this end is not going to come fast. It's going to be around for a while. And so I think that the coalition is there, and here, there, meaning Mexico, and here will fray, and there's a really plentiful forces at work. But at the moment, they're pretty much together. I take a little different view of which is about what the current relationship and the current activities in Mexico are. I think there is a change in Mexico so that when one talked about intelligence 5 or 10 years ago, people were very reluctant to sort of see a consistency between democracy and intelligence. They thought they were antithetical, the military and intelligence. And there's still a residue of that, and we still do that. But those of you who are really interested in this, I would encourage you to look at the press statements that the American Embassy in Mexico is issuing on U.S.-Mexican collaboration and the kinds of things it's talking about now, which I think would have been surprising if you just sort of looked at this from a period of years ago. There's an awful lot of collaboration. We talk openly about intelligence collaboration. We talk almost openly about military collaboration. If you look at General Runar, the head of NORTHCOM, and his statements on this, now you're going to find an awful lot of details about U.S.-Mexican military collaboration on these matters. And so I think, yes, there's a sensitivity that this should be all consistent with rule of law principles, that we've got to be mindful of human rights, and there are lots of, there's a lot of legislation to make sure that happens from the U.S. side. And the Mexicans themselves have changed their constitution, changed their laws, changed their oversight of the security establishment. And so it's a different world than it was, I think, ever has been between the United States and Mexico on these issues. Now, actually, if we could replicate this in a lot of other countries, it would be useful to us. But I would say that there's a lot of good things happening. John just mentioned one of the points of light on progress on some of the drug trafficking. There are a number of points of light, but there are going to be a lot of shady areas and dark areas as well. And so sort of explaining that to a population that is usually they're results oriented. You know, you've got an oil spill, fix it. You've got a problem there, fix it in Mexico and so on. We're an impatient society, I think, and maybe we should be, but the point is we are, and that people are going to get frustrated with not having achieved results. You mentioned the second issue, and I'll stop, and that was the small groups that are involved. Unfortunately, there are quite large groups that are involved here. This isn't just a small, I mean, Al-Qaeda in Iraq was a small group. The Sunni resistance to the United States was a much larger group. Fortunately, we were able to get the Sunni resistance to change sides. And it took years and some very creative, hard work, and it got done. Here, we don't yet have a sort of the equivalent amongst the gangsters in Mexico. And yes, we can shade the distinctions between different types of criminality in Mexico, but the point is you have large numbers of people waiting in the wings for the current generation to be fine, fixed, and seen. They're successors of these are quite decentralized organizations. There's a whole culture, a narco-corrida culture, if I can use the word, that's there. And it's not going to be so easy just to get 10 or 15 or 20% of the guys we would, and think that those organizations are going to collapse. They're not.
Yeah, can I say one thing on that point? I think if you look at the example of Colombia, or even some of the other criminal examples, and even going to organized crime in the United States, I think that's an important point of kind of lessons we don't learn, which is the conventional view is if you take out one of the leadership, they just get replaced. That this is a kind of self-perpetuating, infinitely deep bench. But it's not. I mean, when you actually do this, I would say that if you do this in a systematic way, yes, they start out as wolves. They're dangerous. And you cut the heads off the wolves if you do that. And yeah, there still are more, and there's more of them, but they're like cockroaches. And frankly, cockroaches aren't as dangerous as wolves. And there are different tools you can use against cockroaches, and they don't have the same capacity to be the same kind of threat to you. So we need to have some ability to kind of scale this. But again, we have a lot of what we think is the way this works. I agree on Mexico, there is going to change, but I would point out two things about that. One, Mexico has a unique military to civilian relationship, and from my experience in the hemisphere, where they have a high respect in the society. They have not had a history of that's ugly in the past that complicates this in supporting Mexico. I would point out that that's not always very important in the Congress of the United States. When you go to try to give them something like a Black Hawk helicopter and you talk to Senator Leahy, well, we don't want to give them those. Those are for war, those are oppressive, those are this, those are that. We have a very knee-jerk view of what security services in some of these countries can and should be receiving from the United States in what is a pretty dire situation. And we fought that with Merida. And had to change some of the package mix. Now, why do you need helicopters of a certain kind? Because you're trying to protect people at long range with small forces, and you need to lift a certain number of people. It's a bus that flies, but you got to have a certain kind of capacity, and if you're gonna do certain kinds of missions, it didn't make any difference. They had to change the mix.
Let's move on now to another question back here, please. Right, yes, right on, over here.
Mary Dominic, DC Bar. I wanted to remind the panelists that the IRS, head of the IRS, in Bishop Winter, him said that he hoped that the drug laws didn't go the way of the immigration, or that the tax laws didn't go the way of the drug and the immigration laws. And I was so grateful that Mr. Dawson did this remark. You said that the Mexicans are looking at themselves and just calling the Mexican and major. That we have our problems, lawmakers, law enforcers, judges, also sometimes recreational users. And how can we, with our dirty hands, not absolve ourselves in our world? And I would like to ask Mr. Farrell about the new cartel model.
Well, would you like to? Do you want?
No, I think the point's well taken, but I thought our discussion was really about the foreign activities, not so much the U.S. Side of the border. So I think we would have to restructure our discussion here if we were going to do this. I don't know if our panel is going to do that, but most of us are not so much focused on the U.S. Side of this issue.
Well, again, I think we've gone a long way with Colombia, with other countries in Latin America, including Mexico, about not using this kind of finger pointing or dichotomy as a way of not doing what we should do or not working together. And I think that reflects the reality that, yes, we have too much demand in the United States, but we have reduced demand dramatically in the United States, and that's an ongoing process. I hope the Obama administration, I've written a few few small things about why I'm concerned that they're not focusing on follow-through on this in some of the critical areas like marijuana, which is the single biggest cash crop funding these scumocracy leaders in Mexico that are beheading people and others. We want to pretend this is a safe drug when it's the biggest single cause of treatment need, and it's much more dangerous than many culturally want to let on to recreational drug use. I think it would be nice if the president and maybe the attorney general or the secretary of HHS or even the drug czar currently kind of went out and talked about that, since we've got some goofy stuff going on in DC and elsewhere that's part of the effort to stupidly to legalize drugs, which we already know are a bad idea.
What was your opinion?
Yeah, but the other part of this is drug use in the United States has gone down quite dramatically from the early '80s, and it continues to drop. I hope that doesn't change, as I say, and we've continued to get on top of that demand. In fact, supply hasn't dropped in some cases as much as demand. In some cases, supply has. In the case of cocaine, or domestic production of methamphetamine, and even Mexican production of methamphetamine, of heroin coming from Colombia, heroin coming from Mexico, heroin coming even from Asia. We're blocking some of that in the United States. So the fact of the matter is, we do a lot of work in the United States. We adjudicate a lot of people, our own and some extradited. So I really think the other part of this that you don't say in diplomatic encounters when you're trying to be nice to somebody is, we've carried our freight here. Now we've got to keep carrying it, and we got to follow through on some of this, and I'd like to see, as I say, a little leadership at the national level. But bottom line here is, these countries are having their own consumption problems. Their problems they recognize increasingly are their problems. They're trying to get on top of them with institutional change, as you see in Mexico, Colombia, and elsewhere. We need to reinforce that and create as much of a partnership, because we need to use international laws against these transnational threats as where we can, and where we can't, we're going to have to use other means.
Doug, would you like to comment on this? Because I made a note of one of your comments, one of the points you made, and that was that other markets for drugs are emerging, even as the U.S. consumption declines.
Well, I
Did you
think
say that?
I did say that. Yes, I
Okay,
think
would you like
it's
to-
an interesting trend that will empower the cartels, as I said, long after, if we continue making progress on our own drug issue. I don't know anything about the MENA cartel, so I can't answer that question. But I think that one of the things you're seeing is, and John just alluded to a little bit, is every place where the cartels are expanding, they create a demand. And part of the reason you had some of the huge violence in Ciudad Juarez is because the cartels were paying the local gangs in product, and to get their money, they had to sell that product, so they began killing each other over who controlled what street corner. And what you see in the favelas in Brazil is the same thing, and as they move through West Africa, you're seeing the same type of violence that follows them, because it's much easier for the cartels to drop 100 kilos or 50 kilos or 20 kilos and to pay cash. And then it forces the people on the ground to sell that product to make their money, and that leads to a lot of violence that is the substrata of the macro violence that the cartels go after each other. So I think that, and if you look now, Brazil is now the second largest consumer of cocaine in the world, and it's a huge problem now for Brazil. One of the things, going back a little bit, something leading to what Matt said, we were talking about how to sort of get at this. One of the things I think is really important in looking at these organizations is what Matt alluded to as the facilitators, and Mike Braun and others talk about it. I think that it's very dangerous, and it happens a lot in places where I go, where people say now there's an alliance between the FARC and AQIM in West Africa. And I say that's nonsense. AQIM will load up anything on their trucks, from cigarettes to gasoline to illegal immigrants to go across, and they might go to Matt to move it. And I might come with my Coke, and I'll know Matt can move stuff. I'll give it to Matt. But AQIM and me will never meet. And it's not, there's that type of relationship, as you're talking about hyping the threat, making it more than it is. I think that if you can take out the facilitators and identify them, you can damage numerous groups at the same time. And that's an incredibly important thing that the DEA and Treasury and others have done quite well by figuring that out and damaging it. But it doesn't mean those individual groups have any particular relationship with each other except through the facilitator who's moving their product for them. And so I think it's easy to sort of get overspun up, or overhype what the threat is when Matt says the threats are real enough.
I don't think I'm going to give you a deal just because I know you.
Now we're coming to a time constraint here of several minutes now we have remaining. So what I'd like to do is the following. I'd like to give everybody who would like to ask a question, the hands that are up now certainly, the opportunity to do so. And then when the questions are asked, give each of the members of the panel 2 or 3 minutes to give a concluding comment based upon the questions and any other observations that you want to make. So we'll aggregate the questions. So I hope you'll be taking notes as the members of the panel, as the questions are asked. So let's begin back here, and then we'll work our way up back to the front. So over on all the way on the right-hand side here, on my right-hand side.
Hi, I'm Jerry Levigny, Treasury Department. This has kind of been watching this almost like a wave. Professor Falsgraf, you mentioned at the very beginning, you simplified, but I thought it was a very good simplification of greed and creed. And I guess what I wanted to ask, and then the whole point of Dr. Levitt mentioning the fact of the designations of certain individuals and certain players that were in this as bad players, and then the idea that there's other places besides the U.S. monetary system where things are being sold. So it was coming across to all the way to the point of saving the soul of Mexico, and then finally summing it up with there's some good things we've done, and why don't we start mentioning those good things we've done. I guess the sanctions, this designation, does those things, short of going out and taking out these people, do you feel that they work? Because there's a large debate globally of how good they are and how well they work. And I'm just wondering what the panel feels about that.
Okay, the panel has taken note of that question and observation. Let's go here then for the next one.
Robert Lakin from the Nixon Center. I'm wondering if there might be a grimmer side to Mexico than what has been presented here. Reading the Mexican press and even the American press, there have been stories lately about collaboration between Mexican officials, particularly the Mexican army and the Sinaloa against the Juarez. Could perhaps Professor Batson or others comment on that problem, whether it's real, whether you have other sources of information?
And also, perhaps to add to this, the corruptibility of law enforcement and military groups in Mexico, given the disparity in salaries that they're paid and the funds that may be available as a result of illicit trafficking of one kind or another. That's an area that I was thinking about as I listened to what Roy had to say. So could I maybe ask moderator to add that to well, I have done it anyway. So. Okay, who would like to go next? Please.
I am Fahim Hashimi, an intern in the Hudson Institute. Coming back to the questions which is raised at the topic of our discussion, terrorists and gangs in Latin America undermining democracy. So as the panel has described, definitely terrorists and gangs are undermining democracy in Latin America. Well, my question is whether is there any specific way or any solution on how to get rid of these bad guys, and if yes, how? Thank you.
Okay. How do you get rid of the bad guys? Is the question. Okay, good.
I'll give a quick answer.
Well, add that to the list, and please, in the back, all the way in, who is in the back? Please.
Carlos Eduardo Silva for Center
Make these
International for Enterprise. Basically, my question is for Mr. Douglas Farah. The upcoming Brazilian election, the candidate José Serra has come out against Chavez, has come out against Morales, has pointed out how Bolivia under Morales has increased its exports of drugs to Brazil, and has pointed out that he would basically be a foe of Chavez and its geopolitical plans for the continent. I was wondering what you think about that. Any comments or, I don't know, suggestions, thoughts? Thank you.
And all the way in the back, the next question. All the way back there.
Rafael,
I can't hear you. I don't know if others can or not up here.
Just
and I
speak
up.
Hearing. Rafael Johnstown Hudson Institute. There is a tendency in Latin America for the presidents to increase their terms, and they promote this as a solution to fight terrorism and drugs. In your opinion, the strengthening of the executive branch, is it a viable solution to fight the problems which you have described in Latin America? Because looking at the experience of the Soviet troops in Afghanistan, and the Soviets had a very strong executive government. The Soviet occupation of Afghanistan did eradicate a lot of poppy fields, and I'm wondering whether the strengthening of the executive branch in Latin America can be a viable solution to the problem. I appreciate it. Thank you.
We have a question over here. Can we get a microphone up here? There you go, right there.
Yeah, my name is Greg Kowalski, the Voice of Voice Foundation. Frequently we see those that tend to argue for what we call soft power are sometimes those that tend to criticize the local demand in the U.S. and use those kinds of arguments. And those that are more for the traditional hard power, and those are more strict on some of this the treatment of the drug trafficking. Now, this creates a tremendous ambiguity in messages. So really, the world out there is not really clear about what the U.S. really feels about. Is it for? Is it against? What is it? Because you see so many things that at the same time condemns it completely. Over 1 million prisoners in the U.S. for drug trafficking, and simultaneously the cultural permissiveness of it that doesn't square. Do you think that we have to square this debate first and take a final decision on what it is before we can really reach a final solution, or can we get to there in a number of weeks?
Okay. Now, we're running very close to the wire here, so if you have a question, yes, very quickly. You'll have to be very quick about it. And here is the other two.
Hi, my name is Nicolas Urrutia. I work with the Defense Consultancy based out of Bogotá. There's one broad question for the panel, and then a very specific for Dr. Liebman. The broad one is, in light of this broad scenario you painted for us, what are your thoughts on the new U.S. national security strategy? And specifically, Dr. David, is you mentioned that Hezbollah tried to install small network in Chile as early as the 80s. Chile sounds like a very odd choice within Latin America to do that. And it's not Colombia, Brazil, and places where rule of law and the security forces, local security forces, can really counter those threats into a profitable environment. So what do you know about the strategic decision making within Hezbollah for choosing Chile?
We had probably better stop. Well, all right, one more question. One more, and then we'll stop. Because we're rapidly running out of time.
Yeah, Javier Componi from Whitney College. There seems to be a contradiction in the panels. On the one hand, Douglas talking about voice worrying because of the relationship between Latin America, Latvians, and Hezbollah, and against activity. And on the other hand, we heard also that, well, the drug issue has been involved, there's lots of victories and these issues. But it seems to me that, well, it has been said like that, there has been a great deal of work done in counterterrorism. So, my question is whether what is going on in Latin America, not in terms of the provision of drugs to the US, but in terms of the funding and of the organization of terrorism, is that a real threat to the United States, or is that something that really doesn't?
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Now we should stop all questions and turn to the panel for answers to these questions to the extent that we can do so in maybe 2 or 3 minutes for each panel member. We'll try. Let's start with John Walters.
I won't try to answer all of them. I'll leave that to my colleagues. But let me come to the issue of sanctions, because I think it's a part you may or may not be more inspired to push for them. They are, again, most of them that we've now developed are fantastically important. They are very important both in terms of publicly identifying problems in these governments that they have to deal with. Despite all that debate, as you know, the United States is thought of as honest in these areas. I wish we could do more. I think it would be helpful, for example, even in this area, to produce, we're not going to do this, a map of the hemisphere showing what's governed by whom really, and create some nationalism to take back some of the territory of these areas, which could be done. I think there are other ways of mapping and showing what happens to individuals. I preferred when I was in office, I actually tried to work with people along the southern border to take some of the designated individuals running some of the so-called plazas along the border, the Mexican side, the criminals we were trying to get after, and let's put up a bulletin board with their face on it. And show them a target. When these people are designated, both in terms of the financial tools that we have that you no doubt work with, and some of the other tools that we have, including indictment, the power of American law is considered still great. We can go. We're one of the only countries that goes anywhere in the world and gets people, and we'll get them forever if we have to. And that makes them radioactive. I mean, their friends start saying, I don't know whether I want to do business with you, and you can go after their accounts and their families' accounts and the businesses they have and the people who do business with them or take their money. It's an enormously powerful tool to transform the business and financial sector in Colombia by working with them using these sanctions. I'd like to see that happen in Mexico. I think you should see that happen in parts of Latin America. It would help on, obviously, terrorist financing. It would help on these criminal activities. And I'll just answer one other question on the corruption. There's always going to be corruption. What you're trying to do is create institutions that have vetting, that have integrity, that work, but you've got to continuously work against corruption. I don't really think salary is the issue. Some of these guys make more than anybody at the highest levels of the United States. It's about whether you're going to be honest, whether you create a situation where your family can be somewhat protected, although there are a lot of brave people who work with their own lives and their own families' lives at stake. I've seen very brave men and women. They'll take the threat for themselves, but if you identify the ability to go after their 5-year-old daughter on the way to school, they get less brave. We need to work on ways to both protect them and to go after the target and take the threat away. I would also just mention here, passing at the end, I think we need to recalibrate the degree of force we're willing to apply under legal sanction in these areas, because some of these threats are not simply legally going to be able to be brought into the criminal justice system. And we have had a very huge debate about that already on terror. Some of these threats, if they reach a certain level, and that's what I meant by categorization, we need to think about the kind of force we apply against them.
Right? Thank you, John.
I agree with some, and not with other points. But just to comment to Mr. Lyken's question about what I call the political criminal nexus. And I did not mean to suggest that in Mexico and in much of the many parts of the Americas, there isn't in fact a close relationship between a lot of political people in the government or out of the government, in politics in general, and the criminal elements. And so I did not mean to suggest that there wasn't a major problem with this in Mexico. So without going into the details about the Sinaloa cartel, because it's a long, complicated story, but of which we know some parts. I'd like to come from that point, though, to the next point, which was how do you get rid of the bad guys, to make it a short question. And I would argue that the United States, the UN, the EU, on the whole, has had a law enforcement approach to dealing with criminality, and for a long time with terrorism too. Basically, law enforcement and sometimes military basically was sort of a hard power approach. And I would argue that overwhelming bulk of our aid resources and our resources for counterterrorism, counter-armed groups in general, the UN, the EU, we have been in the same boat. But recently, there has been awareness on the part of the United States, and I would argue the Mexican government, that the hard part alone won't get the job done. You do need to have effective police, military, prosecuting judges, and prisons, and so on. But you do have to get at the soft side, the cultural side. It isn't enough. And that is a relatively recent phenomenon. Before, 98% of the resources of INL in the State Department, International Narcotics and Law Enforcement, was focused on the hard. And now the balance has begun to shift, particularly in Mexico, but a little bit elsewhere. So I think this is the beginning. And so that youngsters now can grow up with sort of an alternative vision than what I alluded to as the narco corrida vision of life, the fast, easy money and nice material lifestyle that you can lead by when you get involved in criminality. And the difficult job it is to go the other road of if you can find a job, but even when you can find a job, it's hard work. It takes a lot of patience and time to go against this phenomenon. But you need the culture. You need people willing to take individual responsibility. And as I said, there's the beginnings of a glimmer that we can get some sort of balance in the architecture that we're developing to deal with the problem. I don't think we're there yet, but I'm just saying it's moving in this direction. But I do agree with John Walter's point that it isn't the disparity between the incomes of policemen and drug traffickers. That's not the problem. That will never be, fortunately, that is not the problem, because we would never be able to match their incomes in that sense. But what is the issue is the other incentives in society for them to stay on the good side as opposed to going over to the bad side. And we've seen in a number of other places in the world where there's been a change. The same police forces, the same laws, the same institutions, and yet we see a change in one place, but not in another. And we have to ask ourselves, why is it the police and the society in some places goes against criminality and doesn't in others? And my favorite example is Sicily. When you look at Sicily in contrast to the rest of southern Italy, to Reggio Calabria, Puglia, and so on, you see a major thing that happened in Sicily that did not happen in the Camorra territory, or the Saccorini, or the 'Ndrangheta territory. And so you have to look at that and say, well, what is different? It's the same country, same laws, same culture, if you will, and something is different. And it was that the culture changed a lot in Sicily. Didn't finish the job, but it added to the mix. And so the police in some places in southern Italy is much more difficult to work with than in others. And the criminals have been able to get their roots. And the same, I would argue, is true was in Hong Kong. You can see the same pattern in Hong Kong. Once upon a time, Hong Kong was the center of crime and corruption in Asia. Well, it's not anymore. It's one of the best places to do business in Asia. What happened? And I would suggest one of the things that happened was, it wasn't that the law enforcement got so much more efficient, it was that the culture inside the country changed. And the Hong Kong government has been very conscious about this and keeping this educational, cultural drama to make sure that the people will go along with it. It's a long story, and I'd be happy to talk about it.
Thank you, Brett. And John?
I have to go, so I'll be very brief. Specifically on the Brazil issue, I think one of the big disappointments that a lot of people in Latin America feel is that there's not been a Latin voice to take on Chavez, and Lula was uniquely positioned because of his background and all to do that, and chose not to do that particularly publicly. And I think Brazil, given its economic clout and its standing in the region and in the world as an emerging power, is uniquely positioned to be able to stand up to Chavez as Latin and take him on in ways that the United States and other people can't do. I think the ambiguity of message, I don't think it's an ambiguity. I think they're two sides of the same coin. I think you have to debate and work on the treatment issues in the United States and elsewhere while carrying out policies of repression. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think they have to be much more complementary than they are, and I think you can certainly hold those two things simultaneously as policies and work toward them. On the presidential terms, I think the best thing that's happened in Latin America was President Uribe's decision not to run again. I think that he certainly could have, and he would have. I think President Lula also gets credit for doing that too. He could have changed the Constitution and run again easily. His popularity was astronomically high. And the fact they chose not to, I think, if you're looking at what works against drug trafficking, you have to have the rule of law. You have to have judicial institutions, and you have to be able to move the war to the next level as you take different steps. And I think for President Uribe, it was obviously a very difficult decision. I think he would be waging the same war against the FARC in his next term as he is now. I think the next person can take the next step and move on to a different type of continuation of confrontation with the FARC that will be different and more appropriate to the moment. And Javier's question about the funding of terrorists, I do think that Latin America is a vital source of funding for a few of the radical Islamist groups, particularly Hezbollah and somewhat for Hamas. And I think that in and of itself presents a danger to the United States on a strategic level. I think when you merge that with all the other cash flows that flow through there that they also have access to, you exponentially increase their ability to fund their activities in our hemisphere and abroad in areas that are going to be very damaging to the United States and already are. So I do think, leaving aside the other things, as you said, if you look just at the ability of Hezbollah to raise, I don't know what Matt's numbers are on the several $100 million in this hemisphere and transfer them back, but that's not good for the United States in the long run.
Finally, Matt, thanks.
Do sanctions work? Yes. But it's a flawed question and therefore a flawed answer, because there are many different types of sanctions. And depending what your goal is, you'll have different types of success. For example, on Iran sanctions, many people say, well, it hasn't succeeded because it hasn't stopped Iran's nuclear program. Well, it was never intended. I can tell you I was there when we came up with the idea of targeted financial measures when I was the DAS for Intel Treasury. None of us were so full of ourselves as to think this was going to put Iran at such mercy that they'd say we give up. But has it been successful at disruption? Absolutely. Have counter-narcotic sanctions in Latin America been successful? Absolutely. Look at Treasury's most recent action taken about an hour before we convened today against another cartel. Very, very effective. And in an effort to keep us to time, I'll just, if you're interested in the issue, the Institute, I co-authored a study called The Money Trail, which is on our website, washingtoninstitute.org. On the issue of soft power and hard power, again, if you'll permit me, wrong question, because it's not a mutually exclusive issue. It is the smart combination of powers, or as it's been put in this administration and even in the last year and a half of the prior administration, all elements of national power. And it's just silly to suggest otherwise. We have a whole bunch of tools in our toolkit. How do you use the right tool? I tell people, if you have an overflowing sink in your kitchen and water's going everywhere and the plumber comes in with any tool, any one tool, I don't care how fancy a tool it is, you're in for a world of pain. What you want is someone who's going to come in with a bunch of tools and use them in the appropriate order and combination and solve your problem. We don't have enough time. I'd argue we didn't have, Hudson should have an event of its own on the national security strategy, which says lots and lots and lots of things. It does specifically praise Brazil on anti-crime, which is interesting. It also, in a sense, suggests that there are no national security interests, because everything is a national security interest. The new national security strategy says that using taxpayer dollars wisely is a national security priority, under the category of really. As a taxpayer, I hope it was last year as well. On the issue of Chile as an odd choice, that actually is part of the wisdom of Hezbollah. Hezbollah will make entree in those areas where it best suits its interests. And in the Chilean example, the fact that they moved into the free trade zones in particular, as opposed to the rest of society, is very telling, where they saw the opportunity for import-export companies in particular operating under less regulation in free trade zones, not only in Chile, but at Zofri in particular, and Iquique as a particularly useful opportunity. The reason the tri-border area is so attractive to them is because it's lawless and there's tons of crime, and it's right at the border, and there's different levels of attention to the issue. You cannot discuss Hezbollah in Brazil with Brazilian authorities. It doesn't exist. Just ask them. And unfortunately, they're wrong. It does. And finally, on the issue of how real is the counter-narcotic, counter-terrorism threat, we've hosted at the Washington Institute Assistant Secretary David Johnson from INL and Mike Braun from the DEA, and the consensus that it is a very, very real threat where it has converged. It hasn't converged everywhere. In those areas where it has converged, it has created a very, very noxious combination. And in South America in particular, what's happened is it has created some of the most vicious, bloody, power-hungry entities that we've faced ever. The bottom line is money corrupts. And when you're talking about upwards of a $30 billion illicit industry in the international narcotics industry, according to the UN, and I usually take UN figures and think they probably need to be bumped, so somewhere upwards of $30 billion, you can understand why people want a piece of that. There are some who believe, some in the US government, there's a debate right now as to how significant Hezbollah's entree into the narcotics market, especially in South America, through West Africa up into Europe, as Doug explained, how significant it is. There are some in US government who believe that Hezbollah now makes more money through that industry alone, through that pipeline alone, than it gets from Iran on a yearly basis, which means hundreds of millions of dollars. And I'll give you just one example. Operation Titan in Colombia a couple of years ago, cracked down on a big drug network there. It was the target of a US Treasury Department narco designation. The entire cell was Hezbollah. This was a Hezbollah narco operation, 18 senior Hezbollah operatives with high ties to senior Hezbollah operatives in Lebanon. But for a variety of operational and diplomatic and law enforcement and other reasons, the decision was at the time not to mention the word Hezbollah. And that's fine with me as long as the bad guys are off the street tomorrow morning, which maybe is the best answer to how do we solve the problem through the wise use of the best tools at any given opportunity or any given moment.
On that note, we shall have to end, and I thank on our collective behalf this panel.